me, for 10 years, for almost 2,000 days, I got nothing done. If my hands were empty and my head was up, and I was looking around to see the way things are, I was doing my job perfectly. And I looked at him, or she looked at him rather, with a mix of adoration and lamentation, to borrow a couple words from the old master painters. And I think that anyone who's had this sort of experience, which I'm sure is most of us, you know, there's something very beautiful about such a scene, at the same time as it's very sorrowful. Your heart kind of brims at the same time as your heart breaks. So we're in Manhattan, and we've approached this building from East 82nd Street, and you see the facade of this building that no matter where you stand, you can't get the whole thing into view. And that to me is emblematic of the Met. I spent 2,000 days standing in this building, but it could have been 50,000 days, and you don't wrap your mind all the way around it. And where I would be headed would be a locker room for about 500 guards. This is just a fraction of them. But let's imagine it's my first few months on the job, where I was sent most often to my home section, which was the old master paintings. And I would be totally alone, except for, you know, figures that Goya painted, or my man Rembrandt right there, or that's Rubens's wife Helena. And this is one of the wonderful things about being a museum security guard. I could think whatever thoughts I wanted about these figures that in some ways felt like the paintings were windows onto strange and distant worlds, but in other ways just felt like my companions, you know, just hanging around all day in the galleries the same as me. I have to say though, you know, I adored working in these galleries. This is the opposite, where it's very intimate and you feel like you're almost inside of a family photo album, where you're becoming familiar with all the episodes from this one young man's short, hard life 2,000 years ago. A painting like this is by Bernardo Dadi at the Met, painted in the 14th century. Maybe a third of Europe died in the bubonic plague, and Dadi himself probably died in the plague. And I don't think it takes much of a stretch of the imagination to understand why these people were interested in the Passion, for instance, which is just an old word that means suffering, and which they clearly thought was at the very heart of the human drama. And I felt very privileged to just be able to stand there in the galleries, bearing witness to these scenes, almost like these figures you see in the corner of this Fra Angelico picture. You know, not studying it the way that a curator might, but just facing up to it, you know, and grappling with what it seems to be about. Which a guard has the time and the space to do, and which I think the old master painters intended for us to do, and I found great solace in that. So here's where I'll back up a moment and tell you a little bit about myself, because this book is, among other things, about a loss that my family suffered. When I started as a guard at the Met, I was just 25 years old. I had had a kind of, previously, a sort of more prestigious job. I was working at the New Yorker magazine in their events department, which is a very fancy magazine. I was in a skyscraper literally at the corner of 42nd Street and Broadway. And of course I thought that was the center of the world. You know, it was the kind of job that impresses people when you tell them about it. And somewhat dangerously for a 22-year-old, I was kind of impressed with myself. But then, while I was working at the New Yorker, my brother Tom got sick. He got very sick with what's called a soft tissue sarcoma, and a type of cancer. And all of a sudden, I was spending, you know, less time in a skyscraper in Midtown and more time in my brother's apartment in Queens and in quiet little rooms at Beth Israel Hospital in Manhattan. And it was very clear that momentous things were going on in those quiet little rooms. And it felt just as clear that, you know, the sort of fancy office building felt like kind of frivolous by comparison, like kind of nonsense, corporate ladder climbing and office politics and things like that. It was such a contrast to the atmosphere of my brother's hospital room, which, you know, to cut right to the heart of things, felt much, much more like an old master painting. And, you know, I'd always been interested in art growing up, but previously, I think if you showed me something like this is by Moretto da Brescia in the Met, it had seemed very exalted, kind of untouchably grand to me. It seems that it was the sort of thing that they put in grand cathedrals and write about in very august, in old books. And I thought that in order to have an understanding of these things, I would have to become very sophisticated and learn all the terminology and learn how to write the sort of erudite article they might print in the New Yorker magazine. I thought that's what you had to do to approach a great work of art. But then my brother Tom got sick, and it was evident that those pictures are trying to express a very plain thing that goes on before our eyes. My brother, he was just 26 years old. He handled his illness with astonishing simplicity and grace. And the entire situation felt very mysterious on the one hand, but very kind of simple and elemental on the other. And, what is there even to say about it? It felt like touching a sort of bedrock, this most basic part of the human experience. And to me, that's how great art often feels. And this was very apparent to me, even in the moment. One morning, my mom, who also loves art, she and I were sitting quietly by Tom's bedside, and he was sleeping. And I looked at him, or she looked at him rather, with a mix of adoration and lamentation, to borrow a couple words from the old master painters. And I think that anyone who's had this sort of experience, which I'm sure is most of us, there's something very beautiful about such a scene, at the same time as it's very sorrowful. Your heart kind of brims at the same time as your heart breaks. And to me, the intermingling of these two sort of supremely primal emotions is the thing that old masters always seem to be exploring in these kind of luminously sad pictures of theirs. Like, couldn't you read either emotion into their faces? Love and pain. So, when my brother died, I didn't want to just rush back to some office job. I wanted to do something nourishing, something straightforward and honest that allowed me to, keep my head up and have my hands empty and be around things that seemed to be important and elemental. I was speechless. I kind of wanted to stand still a while, and I found this marvelous loophole in the universe by which I could stand still for a living in the most beautiful place I could think of. But of course, a guard doesn't just stand quietly looking at Fra Angelico paintings every day. At 10 a.m., the doors of the museum open up, and 7 million people come to the Met each and every year. And it was my job as a guard to make sure that all is calm, that these people play nicely with the works of art. As guards, we do snap into action sometimes. We answer questions and we point you to the bathroom. And when people try to touch paintings, we, jump in front like we're the Secret Service. But all those things take minutes. And then there are these hours to just watch. The job of a museum guard is just very unique for the modern world. I mean, you all are probably busy. I'm busy. You're answering emails, you've got projects you're advancing, you're getting things done. Me, for 10 years, for almost 2,000 days, I got nothing done. And that was the job. If my hands were empty and my head was up and I was looking around to see the way things are, I was doing my job perfectly. Another veteran guard, he gave me this advice. He said, the way you work this job is when you get bored of watching the people, you look at the art. When you get bored of the art, you look back at the people. And there's wisdom in that, but I don't think that I got bored in quite the way you might think. And I think that's because time works differently when you have so much of it. After all, I might start my week with an ancient Egyptian temple, and then the next day with Jackson Pollock. And then maybe I'd go to Congo and look at the power figures, and then end up in Korea and look at the moon jars and I think that's 4th century BC, that pot there. As a guard, you get to learn your way around every nook and cranny of this 12-acre museum, but you also have the time to really reckon with just how much you do not know. More so, I think, than the museum's curators, who spend most of their time in offices, developing sophisticated and refined knowledge in areas where they're the experts. As a guard, I never felt like an expert in anything. I didn't feel like an expert because I was spending 8 hours with this set of gods, and then the next 8 hours with this set of gods. And I was never tempted to try to become an expert in a narrow field because it felt like the more unique thing that I could do is just try and happily and productively fail to wrap my mind around as much of it as I could. And I do think a lot of good comes from that effort. This fellow here, he's a 16th century Sufi, and he spent his time trying to have direct mystical experience of or grapple with the infinite greatness of God, or of reality with a capital R, which is the same thing in his tradition. And guess what? He wasn't going to succeed at that, but it was the effort, it was the practice, it was the attempt that gave his life meaning. And then in all these different wings of the Met, I would also get to do the other major thing that a guard does, which is people watch. You know, they'd ask me for the Mona Lisa. They'd ask me if this museum has any dinosaurs. Where are the dinosaurs? You know, they'd ask me if things are real. Like, is that real? You know, that's from ancient Egypt, it's real? And I always love talking to these bewildered people with kind of big saucer eyes. I never blame them for it, because first of all, I might be just as ignorant walking into their place of work. This is a very big world. None of us really understand it. But also looking at their sort of astonishment and seeing how they're all spun around, I would think, well, they're right. We should all feel that way in the Met. I mean, that's how we should feel in a place that is so big along so many different axes. You know, I don't care if you're the director of the Met. No one knows more than a sliver of what's inside of it. And the sliver that we do know, you know, it's about life and death and suffering and the gods and the cosmos and everything else. And none of us have our minds wrapped around that stuff. I think there are two ways that we as individuals can think of our relationship to a great big museum like the Met. I think on the one hand, they can make us feel tiny and small and insignificant. You know, we see all of these wonderful things that have been made over the course of many centuries that remind us of how big the world is and how full and how old and how diverse and how unconcerned it is with the little nonsense going on in our heads. And we can get that feeling that you sometimes get looking up at the nighttime stars, sort of small, pleasantly small, compared to this great big universe, humbled. And believe me, this is part of the way that I feel right now, being in your country. You know, knowing how little I understand, how much I have to learn, how deeply rooted and beautiful certain traditions are that as a New Yorker, I don't have any connection to. And a part of me just wants to stand back and remain quiet, as I sometimes did in a museum, feeling small and watchful. And actually, this is my first piece of advice in entering an art museum: to quiet yourself down and to spend minutes or hours just feeling small. But there's another way of thinking about art museums too that sort of turn all of this on its head and should actually give us confidence. Because whether we're at the Met or the Louvre or the National Museum of Korea, these museums are showcasing the talents and capacities of human beings, of you and of me. And maybe we should feel proud and empowered and challenged and engaged rather than, you know, just silent and invisible and small. One thing I like to stress is the Met isn't a museum of art history, not really, because it's a museum whose interests, you know, reach up into the heavens and to down into worm-ridden tombs and touch on every aspect of how it feels and what it means to live in the space between these things. And none of these are topics that we can or should leave to experts. You know, that you can't get a degree in these subjects. It takes all sorts of people who have lived all sorts of different lives, who have loved, who have suffered, who have lived in different ways to puzzle through the really great questions. You know, art history is a wonderful thing, don't get me wrong, but I think it's important not only to learn about art, but also from it. The ancient Greek stone carver who carved the Met's famous Koros statue, he didn't want you to think academic and art history thoughts about this. He didn't even know that he was an artist who was making a piece of art for an art museum. He thought he was making a grave marker for one young man who died 2,600 years ago in Athens. And the Greeks perceived of that world as a kind of dark and vague and indistinct region that was formless and bloodless and unknowable, in every way the opposite of life as the Greeks conceived it. And then he imagined that you would lift your eyes and see life as the Greeks conceived it. You know, a youth who is upright and vital, in one sense arrogant, because, you know, the Greeks thought even the gods shared this beautiful form, but in another sense, unlike a god, completely vulnerable, totally unarmored, pierceable by, you know, whatever arrow was shot and killed this young man. And to me, these are the two realities of being human, right? On the one hand, you know, beautiful, possessed of godlike potential, and on the other hand, vulnerable, unprotected, our lives brief and fleeting. But that's just what I think. You know, the important thing is, what do you make of it, is the point. What do you make of your life and of this talented species to which you belong, the same way that the ancient Greeks did, and this vitality that courses through you and keeps you upright like the Koro statue, and the death that you're headed toward. Because if you're alone in an art gallery, he's made out of stone. You're the living thing that's keeping these very Greek thoughts alive. And with that, I'm going to say thank you. Before I do, though, can we give it up for Jade? What a wonderful job she's done. And thank you all.